Secondary dominants are perhaps one of the more important concepts to grasp as a composer in order to develop more compelling chord progressions and in turn, music. In my opinion, it should immediately follow the subject of diatonic functions in theory courses. Smart teachers will do this, whilst others will only briefly mention it. It's a large topic, but I'd like to lay out, in my opinion, the basics of secondary dominants in a no-nonsense manner. So to start off, what is a secondary dominant? Simply put, a secondary dominant is the dominant major or seventh chord that resolves to any chord of a piece that is not the tonic. Although this is the standard definition, I find it misleading, as I think there are actually two types of secondary dominants, those that are related to the key signature of the piece and those that aren't. I would map out related secondary dominants as such. Let's start with G major. I didn't choose this key randomly, it'll make sense later. In G major, we have 7 unique scale degrees on which we can build triads. All but one of these imply certain key signatures in and of themselves. The odd degree out being the leading tone, which forms an F-sharp diminished chord. To be somewhat simple about it, the leading tone degree is not really implying a key signature at all, and is inherently weak, which is why our ears always want it to resolve to the tonic. By extension, harmonically, we can interpret this chord as just the upper 3 notes of the dominant 7th chord of D, which is next to the dominant triad, one of the most important harmonies that is used in G major, besides the tonic. So if we just omit the leading tone diminished triad, we are left with 6 harmonies, these being G major, A minor, B minor, C major, D major, and E minor, which have varying degrees of strength in relationship to the tonic, the strongest of which are the dominant and subdominant, of course, whereafter the mediant and submediant have the next strongest relationship with the tonic. The weakest relationship is between the supertonic and tonic. This hierarchy is determined by the notes shared between the triads of the harmonies and the tonic. The supertonic in this case is the only harmony among these 6 chords to not share a single note with the tonic. This leads to a cadence built around the supertonic moving to the tonic or vice versa to sound weaker than the other possible cadences between the tonic and other degrees. In Tchaikovsky's Guide to the Practical Study of Harmony, one of the first things he mentions is how chords that share notes with each other create the most fulfilling cadences and progressions. Now, you don't always have to have cadences that share notes with each other, but it's a good tip if you want your cadences to sound a little bit more fulfilling. Before, I briefly mentioned that I consider there to be 2 different forms of secondary dominants, these being related secondary dominants and unrelated secondary dominants. So what do I consider to be related secondary dominants? For me, this is any chord that has a dominant characteristic that resolves to one of these 6 harmonies. Essentially, you are borrowing the dominants from each of these chords as if you were suddenly in that key. With the addition of these dominant chords in the context of a piece in G major, you can maneuver to any of the 6 bass chords or degrees in a more satisfying fashion. Even the supertonic, which I categorized earlier as having a weak relationship to the tonic, can be reached more effectively by employing its secondary dominant, as its dominant shares a note with the tonic, and its dominant 7th even shares 2 notes with the tonic. These related secondary dominants are almost like micromodulations, but since it can be immediately reversed by continuing with other degrees associated with the home key, it's not really a modulation in my opinion. Since these dominants all resolve to one of the degrees of G major, they are, in my opinion, related, which is why I use the term related dominants when explaining this to my own students. Oh, by the way, I give Zoom composition lessons, so check out the description to book one. Unrelated secondary dominants, on the other hand, are any dominant that resolves to a chord or degree not in the key of the piece. This could be something like an A-flat dominant 7th chord resolving to a D-flat major triad in a piece written in C major. However, in this video, I would like to place emphasis on what I call related secondary dominants or just related dominants, as they have the strongest relationship to the keys in which they appear. So besides just dominant 7ths and major chords having a dominant relationship, other chords can achieve the same function, but still fulfill the same function as a secondary dominant. I'm referring to other chords like diminished or half-diminished 7ths or dominant minor 9ths, which can resolve in a similar manner to dominants and dominant 7ths, and thus can be effectively grafted into this scheme. I don't want to dwell on this, as the practice of employing different 7th chords besides dominant 7ths and even 9th and 11th chords to fulfill dominant functions in classical music is a topic worthy of an entire video in and of itself, so I can't get too much into it in this video. However, just by adding these additional variant dominant chords, you can already see how the usable palette of chords in just G major has been greatly expanded. So why did I choose G major? Well, there's a piece in G major that demonstrates secondary dominance in a very straightforward fashion, this being Bach's famous Prelude from his cello suite in G major. Although this prelude is written for one singular voice, it is fairly straightforward and forceful in its implied harmonies. If we analyze the very first measure of this piece, this is simply a broken G major chord with A as an auxiliary note. Most of this piece follows the mold of clear broken chords with auxiliary notes, but the implied harmonies are quite clear. The second measure presents the second version of a C major chord, and so on. I'm just mentioning this quickly so you understand how I'm determining the harmonies that correspond to the melodic line. So let's get back to the topic at hand, which is secondary dominance. The first true secondary dominant appears in measure 6, where Bach uses the A dominant 7th chord to lead into the D major of measure 7. The melody continues in D major with the addition of a C sharp, which is not an accidental within the G major key. Some might say this section represents a modulation to D major, but I think it's better explained with secondary dominance, as the section is only, in my opinion, borrowing the accidentals that are part of D major to strengthen the characteristics of the dominant harmony. Additionally, this D major section is far too short to be a meaningful modulation. In fact, the practice of borrowing the accidentals from a harmony's actual key signature as opposed to the key in which the piece is written is fairly common in classical music. And while some like to refer to even these momentary transitions as modulations, I consider them to be brief sidesteps but still firmly within the parameters of the key of the piece. This is up for debate, but for me it's not enough to be modulation. Measure 11 presents either a G sharp diminished 7th chord or an E dominant minor 9th. This depends if you want to view the E as an auxiliary note or actually part of the harmony. Whether it's a 9th or a 7th, the result remains the same, which is that it leads us to A minor in measure 12. Measure 13 implies a B dominant 7th, which resolves to E minor in measure 14. Measure 16 then presents us with a G dominant 7th chord, which resolves to C major in measure 17. Measure 20 implies an A dominant 7th chord, but instead of resolving to D major, Bach resolves to a D dominant 7th, thus lengthening the tension of the phrase. For several measures, Bach plays around with D dominant 7th and D continuously faking out the listener that a resolution is coming, but Bach doesn't give us that simple satisfaction. Briefly, in measure 24, a D dominant minor 9th is implied with auxiliary notes stringing out the dominant characteristic even further. G major, although briefly presented in measure 26, gives way to an implied A dominant minor 9th, which ultimately resolves to the D major harmony, only to revert back to D dominant 7th, which more or less continues till measure 39, where G major is finally and triumphantly reintroduced, thus bringing this musical journey to a satisfying conclusion. The reason I chose this piece is that besides illustrating secondary dominance, it also demonstrates the other chords that fulfill similar harmonic characteristics to dominant chords, which is why I also consider them within the musical realm of secondary dominance, or as I like to call them, related dominance. It also only uses those dominants that resolve to one of G major's scale degrees. So that's as brief an example I could give on secondary dominance, and I hope to have helped you understand just another one of the very important principles in classical music.